Hi, my name is Emily Goodnight. So this week for our online social work class, we watched a TED Talk video of the speech "Can Art Amend History" by Titus Kaphar, and we were asked to reflect on our thoughts about the movement to remove Civil War statues. This is definitely a very controversial topic lately, and I've heard a lot about protests around these statues for them to be taken down. People want these statues taken down because of what they represent in American history. So, if you asked me my opinion on taking down Civil War statues before I watched this TED Talk, I would have had very mixed emotions. I wrote a little bit about my thoughts on this topic before watching the video, so I would have like an accurate comparison. I definitely was on the fence about this topic, but I never had really taken much time to reflect on what I really thought. There was part of me that said that, we should leave them because, you don't want to erase history. We can learn from it. We can learn how to not repeat history. But if you would have forced me to give you either a yes or no answer, yes, take down the statues, or no, leave them, I probably would have said, yes, take the statues down. Because should people who represent and stand for such horrific things really have statues standing of them in very public places? And usually, when I first see a statue of someone or something, my first thought would be that that person or thing must be honorable or represent something great if someone really took the time to create this amazing, expensive piece of art that represents that person. So, when I think of statues, I first thought of outside of Reynolds Coliseum of the statues of Jimmy V and Kay Yao, who both could be considered honorable people here at NC State. And these Civil War statues that we're talking about don't represent a great time in our American history. Therefore, I would have agreed that, maybe these should be removed, and I would agree with the movement to remove these Civil War statues. So after watching this TED Talk, my mind was definitely changed thanks to Titus Kaphar. If you now ask me if I agreed with the movements to remove these Civil War statues, I would say no, we should leave them. Um, there are things that these sculptures represent that are part of history, and they're real, and they happen, and there's no erasing that history, even by taking down these sculptures that represent it. What we can do instead of taking them down is amending them, like Titus said. I really like what he said about how we can amend these pieces. We can do this by changing our lens and shifting our gaze when we looked at these statues and other art that represent history. These pieces of art represent 1,000 words, and there's so much history behind paintings or statues. We need to shift our gaze when we think about these pieces of art. And yes, they represent a sad part of our American history, but we can use this art to learn and to compare history to where we are today. It was really interesting to me to hear the story that Titus shared about whenever he took his sons to the Natural History Museum, and his son questioned his concerns about the Teddy Roosevelt statue with the Native American walking on one side and the African American walking on the other side of him. I thought this was really cool that a 9-year-old boy was able to notice this, because when I think of the statue, unfortunately, what I see is, big, brave Teddy Roosevelt up on his horse. And I think that was kind of the point of him being way up high, like he talked about in the art painting when the certain people were way up high. It kind of helped represent their status. So I think that that definitely was part of this art, that, Teddy Roosevelt was way up high and the Native American and African American walking along below him was definitely symbolic of a lot of pieces of history. So yeah, that was really cool that his son was able to notice that this was not fair and it was confusing. Why this unfair and wrong sculpture was in this great museum. It wasn't fair that these two men had to walk while this Teddy Roosevelt got to ride up on his horse. And so I think the way that we amend looking at this statue is by recognizing this unfairness and talking about it and talking about the history that's behind it and how American has changed from that point into what we are now. And we can also recognize that, yes, we still have a lot of work to do with these topics, but we can use these sculptures and pieces of art to prove that the change is possible and that improvement is possible. So once in high school, I had a history teacher that used to say and remind the class that the reason why we were required to learn history is so we can make sure not to repeat the history. So I think this is very applicable to this situation. And like Titus said, he learned so much about history through art because he was such a visual learner. And I wouldn't want to destroy valuable visual learning tools. And I no longer think that we should take down these pieces of art which can serve as these major learning tools for people. So yeah, my opinion was definitely changed by this TED Talk. I went from leaning to the side of, yes, like let's remove these statues and pieces of history because they represent a poor part of American history. But now I definitely agree with Titus that we don't want to erase and eradicate, but we should use what has happened, whether it's bad or good, and just recognize that it did happen and use these pieces of art to learn from the bad and the good in our history. So that is my thoughts on removing Civil War statues.